I don't think it's any secret that I prefer games that tell a story, even when it's just there to bridge the gap between levels. A solid story can sometimes be all it takes to make a good game great. The development of a good game is a whole complex equation. Yeah, gameplay plays a part in it, but I think a lot of people, myself included, would be surprised at how small a part gameplay actually plays in the foundation of a great game. Sure, it kinda goes without saying that if the gameplay isn't enjoyable, then the game's not going to feel great. But what happens when we start dialing back on the interactivity? Not every game has to be a fast-paced and challenging experience, much like how not every game requires you to really activate the deepest corners of your mind to solve puzzles. When I was younger, like a lot younger, we used to be able to get free games from cereal boxes. Most of them were adaptations of board games like Candyland or Sorry, and occasionally you'd luck out with something like Roller Coaster Tycoon. But cereal box games will always stick out to me because they were my introduction to point-and-click adventure games. Back in the late 90s, or maybe the early 2000s, I ended up with a copy of Freddy Fish 3 for Windows 95. I don't believe I ever actually finished it, but ever since then, whenever I think of games that have dialed back or minimal gameplay, that is what I think of. Not Freddy Fish specifically, point-and-click adventure games. Look, I'm just trying to build context for the rest of the video here. Anyway, point-and-click adventure games are pretty laid back when it comes to gameplay mechanics. They kinda have the whole thing outlined in the name, point and click. But I think we all know at least one of these games that's made some massive impact on someone's life, so how do they do it? Well, it really depends on the individual game in question here. As a whole, I'd say the genre makes up for the lack of constant input by amplifying every other aspect of the experience. Mostly that comes from the story and theming, but sometimes that can extend to unique aesthetics or sound design. And of course, iconic characters. Shoutouts to all the Putt-Putt fans in the comments. Now, I've played my fair share of point-and-click adventure games in my day, but I don't think any of them could prove my point any further than the focus of today's video, Genesis Noir. Which is, of course, a point-and-click adventure game by Feral Cat Den. The interactivity in the game is very streamlined, taking a backseat to its poetic story and its presentation. At first, that might sound strange. Games are supposed to be all about interactivity. That's the whole definition of gameplay. Without that, it's just a movie, or like a graphic novel or something. Digital first comics do exist after all. There's even one based on Genesis Noir, and it's pretty cool. It uses moire patterns to simulate animation, much like actual printed optical illusion books. But of course, that minimalistic gameplay style is far from a bad thing. The interactivity in this game is still engaging and feels almost diegetic, more so than most point-and-click adventure games that I've played. Most of these sorts of games focus on clicking around the environment to see what you're even able to interact with, never making it clear enough to know for sure. The intent there is to get the player to explore the environment, find items they can use, and then usually combine them into some nonsensical invention in order to solve whatever problem they're faced with. Genesis Noir breaks that mold, oftentimes making it clear what you are and aren't able to interact with, just by hovering the mouse over an object. Very few of the scenarios presented in the game actually take place as complex puzzles, clearing up that space in your head where harebrained schemes happen and replacing them with more immersive and emotional experiences. Overall, I like that direction. There will always be a place on the market for madcap adventures, but there's just something I really dig about minimalistic and poignant affairs. But of course, that's also not the first time I've said that on this channel. If you want to know more about that, go check out my video on Greece. Needless to say, Genesis Noir's biggest strengths stem not from its gameplay, but rather from literally everywhere else. If you're looking for a heavily stylized game with an iconic vision, you really ought to look no further. Now, I'm no art critic, so there's a chance I have the history a little bit wrong when I talk about the aesthetic. So, if you know anything about what I'm about to describe, please leave your expertise in the comments and I'll choose one to pin. But anyway, Genesis Noir's visual style takes heavy influence from film noir of the 40s and 50s, with a hint of Art Deco, which peaked somewhere in the 20s and continued into the late 30s. What that means for this game in particular is that there's not much color. Almost all of the graphics are monochromatic, meaning that everything is a varying shade of this bluish black and yellowy white, with a few golden highlights thrown in for good measure. Everything is represented with a very abstract sort of line art, giving it a super distinct style which I frankly had never seen anywhere else before finding this game. and it's a big reason why I ended up looking into it in the first place. Those of you who have seen my last video about Bastion know that I'm a sucker for good presentation, so when you show me this art style, you can expect that alone to sell me on the game. But of course, it wasn't that alone that sold me. The music of Genesis Noir is also incredible, lending every ounce of its jazzy style to support the beautiful animation on screen and amplify each moment of the story and the gameplay. The original soundtrack provided by Skillbard is incredible and extremely faithful to the style that the game aims to emulate. But it also doesn't stop there. There are several sections of the game where the player has some kind of influence over the music, such as a call and response jazz battle, for lack of a better term, between the main character No Man and a bass player he meets on the street. It starts out as a simple Simon Says sort of minigame, but shortly turns into a chance for the player to compose their own rhythm, and for the bass player to respond with a more complex spin on it, later evolving into an entire musical interlude where the player can improvise along with the game's regular backing track. This was probably the most memorable part of the entire game for me. It all came together so seamlessly, and it sounded so great. I never stop being amazed by the sheer ability of game developers to create such immersive experiences. It's clear that a massive amount of thought and effort went into these systems, all just for a few moments of gameplay. It blows my mind. But there's still one piece of the puzzle that we've yet to talk about: the story. And don't worry, I'm not going into spoiler territory here. The story of Genesis Noir is, as described in the trailer for the game, a cosmic adventure of love, loss, and betrayal. The plot revolves around No Man, who represents time, as he attempts to stop Golden Boy, who represents entropy, from killing his love interest, Miss Mass. The narrative is told as a series of vignettes taking course over the entire history of the universe, past, present, and future, right up from the few microseconds after the Big Bang to the theoretical Big Crunch, when everything collapses back in on itself. It's heavily inspired by a collection of Italian short stories by Italo Calvino called Cosmicomics, which follow a protagonist named Quific, which is entirely unpronounceable. But for the sake of this video being an auditory experience as much as it is a visual one, I'll take some liberties with the pronunciation. As I was saying, Quific is a higher dimensional being who's present at each of the pivotal moments in the universe's history, and each short story focuses on one of those moments, often exploring some scientific fact about the universe, although some of those are just hypotheses or have since been disproven. I personally find that concept for fiction writing to be extremely compelling, so of course I picked up a copy of the collection for myself. And my original plan was to give this a brief review here too, in case anybody really liked Genesis Noir and wanted to give Cosmicomics a chance. But my schedule's been a bit too bonkers to really bite down on it myself. If that sounds like something you might enjoy though, please let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do about putting a brief review up on my second channel. Link in the description. But anyway, I'm sure it goes without saying that I'm going to get hooked on any game with the catch line, "Stop the Big Bang." If you're a fan of point-and-click adventure games, jazz, film noir, vintage aesthetics, or space, this is the game for you. Genesis Noir is one of the most heavily stylized games I've had the privilege of playing, and that's one more thing that makes indie games so great. The ability for developers to make something so experimental and unique is exactly what makes these games stand out, and I'm really looking forward to playing more games like it in the future. For now, I've been Cosmo. Thanks for watching.